In the first video today, I want to start by giving you an overview of cellular metabolism. So cellular metabolism is a set of chemical reactions required to maintain life. And we've talked about a little bit about cellular metabolism, and we've talked about catabolic reactions that break molecules down. So we can have complex carbohydrates that undergo catabolic reactions to break them down into individual monosaccharides. And we've talked about anabolic pathways that build molecules, right? So we talked about pathways that link a bunch of glucose together to make glycogen or starch. So these catabolic pathways and anabolic pathways. And what we're really going to focus on for the next couple classes is cellular respiration. This is a subset of metabolic reactions that convert biochemical energy from glucose into ATP. So first we're going to talk about aerobic cellular respiration by eukaryotic cells. This is really going to be our focus, and this process requires oxygen. And as I mentioned, it starts with glucose. And what we're going to do with that glucose is convert it to ATP. Now, cells only have enough ATP in them to sustain life for about 30 seconds, or sustain activity for 30 seconds. And ATP is unstable, so most cells need to be making it all the time. So most cells are undergoing cellular respiration all the time. And many of our macromolecules can be metabolized. Glucose, which is a carbohydrate, is the most easily metabolized. But lipids and proteins can also be metabolized. We're really going to focus on glucose. So first, cells must obtain glucose to make ATP. So plants are able to make their own glucose during ATP, but we have to eat it and obtain it from our food. And we have to get it into our cells, and it can enter into our cells by diffusion, the GLUT1 protein, which is a carrier protein, or the sodium glucose transporter if we wanted to get even more glucose into our cells. And organisms, like ourselves, can store glucose as either glycogen or starch, and then we can break that down to release more glucose into our system. So first we get our glucose, and then what we do is we oxidize our glucose. So when glucose is oxidized to carbon dioxide, by burning, some heat or energy is released. So a little bit about what oxidation is. So glucose and oxygen, I told you oxygen is involved, is going to be converted into CO2 and water, okay? So glucose, right, that carbon in glucose is eventually oxidized, right, in CO2 because the carbon loses electrons, and oxidation is loss of electrons, oil, okay? And then the oxygen is reduced. So remember, those redox reactions are always combined, and because all this glucose is oxidized, we can release energy as heat or light in a free system. But in cells, glucose is oxidized in a long series of reactions, of carefully controlled redox reactions. And the released energy is then used to synthesize ATP. And these reactions comprise cellular respiration. So that is cellular respiration. It's when we take a molecule of glucose and some oxygen to make CO2, water, and ATP. We're going to go over all of these reactions to generate these products. These reactions can be broken down into 4 steps. Okay, the first step, which we'll talk about today, is called glycolysis. And in glycolysis, we take glucose and we convert it to 2 molecules of pyruvate. And this process happens in the cytosol of eukaryotic organisms. We generate some ATP in this process, as well as some NADH. The pyruvate then moves into the mitochondria, where it's processed and then gets incorporated into the citric acid cycle. We make more ATP and more NADH and FADH2. These are coenzymes that are electron carriers. These electron carriers that carry electrons that were generated by the oxidation of glucose, so these were reduced. These reduced molecules that have higher potential energy then go to the electron transport chain, and they give up those electrons they're carrying to the electron transport chain. And then through another series of reactions, those electrons are moved down the chain to generate even or the most amount of ATP. And again, we'll talk about these all in detail. So as you move through each of these 4 steps, glycolysis, pyruvate processing, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain, what you should ask yourself is these key questions. What goes into the reaction and what comes out? What happens to the energy that's released? Where does each step occur in eukaryotic cells? And how are the different reactions regulated? So just as an overview, once more, in these first 3 steps, we're going to remove electrons from glucose, so we're going to oxidize it, and we're going to transfer those electrons to electron carriers and make ATP. Okay, so here's our glucose in the cytosol. We'll convert it to pyruvate. This is going to make 2 ATP and 2 NADHs, right? And then this pyruvate is going to get processed into acetyl-CoA. That's another output of the pyruvate processing step. And then the acetyl-CoA is going to go into the citric acid cycle, and the citric acid cycle is going to go around because it's a cycle and make ATP. It's going to release more carbon dioxide. You have some carbon dioxide released here, and it's going to reduce NAD plus to NADH and FADH2. These are electron carriers. You had an electron carrier come out of this reaction, and then all these electron carriers, right, go into this electron transport chain. And what this electron transport chain does is it creates a electrochemical gradient in the mitochondrial membrane. And then this electrochemical gradient is converted to mechanical motion through this ATP synthase, and then that pops on a phosphate to ADP to make a whole lot of ATP. And so again, I don't expect you to remember all of this, but I want to start to give you this picture of a lot of things moving around, and this figure nicely shows you what goes in and what comes out and where the reactions occur. But we're going to go all of them into detail. And so as I pointed out, right, carbohydrates, which are glucose, can be metabolized, right, in a catabolic pathway, but a lot of these other macromolecules can get incorporated into different parts of these pathways that we're going to be talking about. In addition, some of the parts of the pathway can be used in anabolic pathways to build more complex molecules. So you can pull some fatty acids out of this acetyl-CoA to make phospholipids and fats. Some of the citric acid cycle have some substrates for amino acid synthesis, right? So building molecules and breaking down molecules. But what I want you to remember is that there's 4 steps of cellular respiration. This might be something I ask as a quiz question. Glycolysis, pyruvate processing, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation.